Hello and welcome back again to the next episode of Vocation. Thankfully, once more, I'm joined by the great Michael Tsarion. And we've been building upon what we've been talking through the last few episodes, largely about psychology and about consciousness. And we were going to go a little bit deeper into that today about speaking about some of the deeper questions. And that starts off with one of your articles, Michael, where you have titled it, "Who Are You Really?" And so my first question that I'll pass it over to you. Who are we really, Michael?
Who are we really? Well, that's right. This is the big question, of course, and it's a question for philosophy, it's a question for psychology. But, even if you don't have those disciplines, at some
Hmm.
point in history, somebody stood somewhere, some shepherd, some merchant, riding along in a carriage or on a donkey and just went, what the hell is this all about? I mean, we know if we ask it, it must have been asked by some person. And then you go and you look at Great Pyramids and you get these megalithic sites, these marvels like Göbekli Tepe all over the world. Was this made by kind of unconscious people? Probably not, right? There's a lot of advancement there. So we can also imagine then that in these mystery schools of the ancient world, there was also a different kind of advancement. It wasn't just technical advancement, but there might have been sort of psychological or philosophical advancement in terms of questions. And then you get this weird anomaly that the article sort of slightly addresses. I don't know if you want to read the first caption first to set before I
Yeah.
jump in. It's just a small paragraph. You could read it about this idea of metaphor, and then I could pick up from there.
Yeah, super. I'll call it up. So, for anyone else looking to find this article, this is on Michael's Substack. And again, it's titled, "Who Are You Really?" And so I'll start off. It begins with a quote from Carl Jung. "To find out what is truly individual in ourselves, profound reflection is needed. And suddenly we realize how uncommonly difficult the discovery of individuality is." And so your article begins, If you asked a friend, what is it like to be you? Could they offer an answer that made any sense? Even more puzzlingly, what do we mean when we use the word like? Surely this implies a problem. Do I want to know what something is like, or do I want to know what it really is in itself? There is something strange here, something we rarely spend time trying to understand. Is it really possible for us to do the latter? Of course, it is not possible for you to know what it's like to be anyone but yourself. You will never know what it is like to be someone else. You can ponder what it's like, but you're already off to a bad start because the word like doesn't really mean what it appears to mean. The word suggests metaphor. What's that about? One asks. And so, any comments there, Michael, to start us off
Yes,
with?
this is huge. You see, this is absolutely huge. And why it was good to read it before I continued was because if you ask the materialist, we've already said that they're reductionists, and all that really means when you unpack it is shallow. So they do offer explanations, but these are mostly made for the dumb show. They are incredibly shallow, and a little bit of thought shows you that there's something inadequate there, right? And this is a case in point. If it's all a matter of just blind evolution done through, well, they're saying it, millennia, then you tell me why we are so far from the mark when the human mind wants to address what it is. If everything was this move towards clarity was for the sake of survival, for the sake of progress and accuracy, then in this regard, we don't seem to have made a smidgen of development. Right? We're even talking about here, and primarily actually talking about the history of language. That doesn't seem to have helped us one bit. In fact, it seems to be the problem. So the evolutionist is going to want to, bow out. He's going to want to pretend he's got a bus to catch. If you ever went down this road, they've got problems with time, and they've got problems with space, and they've got problems with language. Now, they've done their best to sort of smoke screen these problems. But this little paragraph that you read goes to the nub of it, because they can't answer this. Because again, if in the thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of the development of the brain, the development of language in order to communicate, then when it comes to being able to communicate, when a mind tries to explain what it is, we are unbelievably uncommunicative. What we get is deflection, and what we get is symbolism, and we get this simile, and we get this metaphor. And that's embodied, you see, in this word like. We don't even notice how many times we use that word. In fact, even if we ask what is black or white, it's really axiomatic that we always say, well, it's like this. It's like kind of gray. Well, what's gray? Well, that's kind of like this. That's a thing called color. What's color? Oh, well, you see, and on it goes. Ad infinitum, where the things almost deflect on purpose. When you go to interrogate a thing, and this goes for consciousness or almost anything else, there's this slippery aspect that nobody's ever noticed. And the great scholars, men like Owen Barfield, the British mystical philosopher, noticed that, funny enough, when you go back in time, he was thinking here of the English language, but it goes for other languages as well. Metaphor doesn't get less. Metaphor gets more, meaning it gets more colorful. You think of Shakespeare, think of Chaucer, think of the old Anglo-Saxon, think of the old bardic poetry. The further you go back, the richer the language gets in metaphor. And if anything, where we are now with Ebonics, it's actually get less good, although metaphor is still huge today in what we do, right? And how we speak. So this is a historical problem. Where did it come from? Why is language, after millions of years of development, obscure on this point? The opposite. The evolutionist knows that things get more clear. Things get more precise. Our knowledge of the world should be more accurate. Sure, that's what science itself is all about, let alone language. And yet in this area, it's completely inadequate and blunt. Yet they can't actually point to the reason why that is. And the man who can, somebody like, say, for instance, an Ian McGilchrist, who talks about left brain, right brain divide, or Julian Jaynes, people who kind of give you, a little bit of a direction on why that might be, they are cancelled by the academics in their own institutions. Hold on. But come back to the point. First of all, when you want to know something about the mind, you're asking the mind for the answer. Right? Everything we know about consciousness, you and I have spoken about this before, everything we know about consciousness is by way of consciousness. But that means then there must be a dialectic going on, right? Where there's a call and response, a speaker and a listener, but a listener and a speaker, a dialogue going on within. And of course, we know there is. But that in itself is a mystery. How can a monad, how and why does a monad split itself? What's the mechanism of that? Why would it do it? And how does it do it? What ordained? Because if that happened, then I want to know what the underlying, mystery is that ordained that. No, we're not there yet either. We spoke about this exact same thing, but in a slightly different context when we said, why did we develop an unconscious and a conscious? They're a reality. It's empirical. It's scientific. When you go to sleep, you're in the unconscious state, aren't you? If I knock you on the head, you're in an unconscious state, aren't you? So everybody knows they've got these two things. It's empirical. But why? What ordained it that that's going to happen? They just tell you something about evolution. That's not an answer, because evolution is a mystery. What caused that? They go, well, like, Sartre or others. Well, the world filled you up. The will, you were tabula rasa, you were blank slate, and the world did this and that and the other. Well, where did the world come from? You just assume, right? Because it's an object. Where did that object come from, and how do I relate with it? Martin Heidegger is talking about you being a being in the world. And in doing that, he axed the whole hard Cartesian divide. We haven't talked about that. I'm not going to talk about it now. But there's philosophers out there who showed you that this divide, this hard divide between subject and object, is a myth. It's an illusion. Yet this was accepted as this is the heart of materialism. When Descartes came along, we have Cartesianism. And that was what derailed German idealism. Or idealism attempted to answer this. But no, the British and the French loved it. They loved this Cartesian. René Descartes himself was a Frenchman. And the British went, oh, he's nailed it there. He's talked about hard divides, that man is separate from the animals, man is a stranger in the world. And the only reason he's not a completely deceived being about reality is because there's a good God, that prevents him from being completely deceived. All this palaver, all this circuitous nonsense, and we could get into that. I mean, it's just endless. But the point is, consciousness is explaining itself. Everything I know about consciousness is from consciousness, and I've never bothered noticing that that is incredibly paradoxical. There's nothing else like that. How can I trust it? Well, how can I even get out of the loop anyway? You see, this is a loop that you won't be able to get out of. To get out of it means to be completely unconscious. Now, as a matter of fact, go ahead.
Just on that point, I was thinking of other examples. I remember I'd listened quite a lot to Alan Watts before. I know you're a big fan of as well, also, I believe. And he used to give the examples of, in the way that the mind can't know itself, is kind of like the knife. If it can cut anything, but it can't cut itself. It's like fire, it can burn anything down, but it can't burn itself. In the same way, you can't, you can't bite your own teeth. That kind of way. You can't kiss your own lips.
That's right.
You had a very poetic way off it as well,
Yes.
but it was just exactly what you were on to there of this issue of fundamentally of how the mind can't grasp itself.
And we're stuck with it. There's no objective Archimedean point outside. So in other words, this means then, this takes you in a lot of very deep areas we won't be able to cover. But one thing that it talks about means is that the whole concept of objectivity is a myth. You can't even step outside your own mind, ask legitimate questions about the mind. We've just proved that. Then what is this word floating around called objectivity? Right? And if you don't have an object, then the subjectivity breaks down as well, because I only know I'm a subject in a world of objects. But if objectivity turns out to be a very slippery and insubstantial thing, on a fundamental level, I mean, or in a workaday way, yeah, okay, great. I can see that there's an objective world there. But if deep down on the basal level, objectivity just, short circuits, how can I be even knowing that I'm a subject? Well, the existentialist came along and said, but that's what the point we've been trying to make. You're not. What you call a subject is a pastiche of society. You and I have talked about the role of the superego. After the superego's done with you, and after you've embodied all of these parental imagos, and after you've sold your soul to identify with the crowd, then the crowd gets installed in your head, right? You're not just a member of a crowd. No, the crowd is well and truly installed in your head. What you call subjectivity is a construct that overwrites the self. In fact, most neurotic traits, people are in a state of misery because it's unable to overcome the self completely. People are not in a state of existential misery and angst and anxiety because they have a self that they want to express. It's that this thing's made of rubber or made of adamantine material and won't go away, so they can be happy discontents. Their anxiety is that the soul, the spirit of man, can't be crushed. And so through the centuries, we've developed more and more drugs, more and more medications, more and more therapies, more and more distraction to get as close as we can to the annihilation of the self. Doctor, save me from being a self. One psychiatrist said, one of his clients said, Doctor, I would just be fine if it wasn't for reality.
Yeah.
What?
Let me go back to the womb.
Yeah. I would be just fine if it wasn't for reality. T.S. Eliot, the great poet, said, man can't bear too much reality. You see? Where did this come from? Who thinks like that? And why?
It reminds me of a Nietzsche quote. I remember he said, you judge the soul of a man by how much truth he can handle,
There you go.
I thought that's
of
bang
course
on
you
for it,
can.
isn't it?
Right. And of course, this man then is the outsider.
Yeah.
Now, earlier we spoke about the Trinity, right, called the Eigenwelt, the Umwelt, and the Mitwelt, right, this triangle that the existentialists thought that a man was. Well, there's another trinity. There's another triad that's important for people to know about, and it's this one that we kind of alluded to just a minute ago, but it was central to the German idealists. And it was this trinity, this triadic movement from unconsciousness to consciousness to self-consciousness. Rocks and stones and clouds, mountains and trees, these are completely unconscious. It's agreed that then animals are conscious for the most point, not all, but the vast majority of animals are in a conscious state, but only the human beings and maybe some of the higher animals are self-conscious. So this has an anthropological, you can map that over the movement of history, and you can also map it over the history of a child, over what they call ontological life, an individual life, from the child who is unconscious in the womb, then becomes conscious more, and then finally becomes self-conscious. So the great Hegel and the great Schelling were absolutely fascinated by this, right? And they wanted to account for it, and that's what the bulk of their works is to do, and to show you how absolutely original and amazing, right, that is, this movement. And of course, it's an upward movement, the way they looked at it, and it's rare. It separates man from the animals, but nevertheless, even the self-conscious being finds it difficult to explain where he came from, and his memory is not such that he can really remember these earlier stages. So I don't know if you've and I have talked before about Immanuel Kant and his divide between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. Yeah, the known and the unknowable. This sort of applies to that, because as a matter of fact, they were answering Kant by a lot of what we're talking about right now. So without getting into all the details, they said, no, it's not that Kant was right about this noumenal being this unknowable substance or unknowable realm, which is permanently screened off. That's not the case. They prefer to think of it as the stages in the darkness and the mist of time prior to us becoming fully realized, human beings self-consciously. To become self-conscious, it's like that lighthouse again. The upper stages is narrow and highly bright and highly focused. But in order to be that, everything in the antecedent stages is thrown into darkness. Schelling talked about a mountain, in which you may be standing at the peak, but everything is shrouded in mist. Now, there's a mountain there. You got here somehow, right? You know that much. But really, when it comes to going down below the mist to find out the details of how your consciousness arose, that's off limits. For most of us, right? He talked about intuition. He talked about mystical insight. He talked about imagination. Yeah, and they knew about revelation, right? But on the whole, no, despite all of those other sensory abilities, this is the real noumenon. So they amended Kant, you see? I just wanted to bring this out, that there's a noumenal all right, but it's not as Kant described it. It's just something that happened in the great titanic movement as we move it to where we are now. And to get to where we are now is so precious. But one of the downsides of that is you don't have panoramic view over all the stages where you came from. You can't remember what it was like to be a worm. You can't remember what it was like to be, a camel, right? Or a rock or anything like that on the great journey of evolution. And probably there's not even a need. It may be written in your DNA, but you're not conscious of it, because the self-consciousness is a property that you need, and it's taken millions of years to get here. But then all of this highfalutin philosophy still leaves us in a predicament. We come full circle to what we talked about. What on the earth? Why is the mind so reluctant and so vague when it comes to explaining what it actually is? And this was embodied in this idea of like. Because if I say that I'm like something, it should be apparent by now that that's not the same thing as saying what I really am. Yeah. And language is part of the problem. Yet language is something that clearly evolved. But when it evolved, from the very beginning, we were using metaphor. So in order to orient ourselves, very few people even ever think about this ever, but if you try to orient yourself, usually the way to do it would be to start with what the materialist says about this. because that would at least give us a starting point. And they have the most shallow explanation for it. They've looked at language and they see the metaphor and they just say, well, we came into the world and found everything sort of mysterious, and we were on our road to survival. Everything was just based on survival. And therefore, over time, when we're surrounded by all these mysteries and couldn't understand this and we couldn't understand that, it became a habit to explain a thing by another thing. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. They don't go any further. They just say, in order to understand one thing that might be a little bit difficult to understand, we compared it with another thing, and that is meant to have helped us. Now, there's no doubt to a degree that is true. But to reduce it, the whole of language and the whole movement of that, to this, and to say that, it was a human incompetence that went to all this phenomenal industry, is really not to explain anything. It's like I said, they explain things away. There's an element of truth to that. But as I said, it's an infinite one, because the thing I'm trying to explain by another thing also itself needs to be explained. That's a hell of a lot of energy. In the evolutional process, why is the first thing not just completely clear? Why all this industry? Why all this energy wasted? I thought it was about survival. Survival needs to be efficient. The human see, so here they're pointing to something that runs at loggerheads across purposes with their entire paradigm. Things are getting more complex in the bad way, less understandable, more slippery, not clear. So this, I don't have the answer to this. This is just extraordinary. Carl Jung, I have a quote from Carl Jung in the article saying, consciousness is actually quite a young thing. Most people agree about that. So, these things may be way off in the future as far as we know yet. And maybe they're just conundrums that can never be understood. But then when you deal with the non-materialistic person who wants to talk about these issues like language and metaphor, then you get to somebody like Owen Barfield. And his take, of course, is completely different. He not only talks about the immense color of metaphor and its prevalence, and that it's the heart of language. He doesn't want to look at it as a bad thing. And he doesn't want to simply reduce it, that man in a state of pig ignorance, with a brain that was like a rock, had to simply, compare that to this to get an understanding of that. It was a little bit too utilitarian, right? No doubt there's an element of that. But the color and the wonder of language, again, we could talk about our Shakespeare's, and you could talk about the great poetry of the ages. Look, come on. There's something so much more that the materialist doesn't want to talk about. Now, a few shows ago, you asked me about this, about, the deconstruction of language by the deconstructionists. Remember, we're language and meaning. Of course, they're going to want to deconstruct language and say it has no meaning, because they don't want to go in this Barfieldian direction, because they know what it'll mean. I'll explain in a minute. But before we get there, they don't want to go there because they're already 10 times smarter than the average person. And they know they want to close the gates. They want to put up the minefield so that you never go in the direction we're going to go in a minute. Yes, there's big money behind them, and there's mutilation behind it. And there's cancel culture involved, because even if you have some Johnny from within their own institutions, I've already pointed this out, that comes up and looks like they may be going there. Oh, do you think that they're going to want to teach Owen Barfield in the universities of the world? I just told you they penalize the men, right, who even go in that direction. You're canceled. That's it. No, you're not going to go there. Well, at the same time, they promote the hell out of these materialists I just mentioned. They get the top seats. And then they sit there like vultures, censoring and marking down any kid, you see, who comes along, who does what we're doing right now and points these things out. Where did these metaphors come from? Why is poetry an ancient language? I mean, and once you get into like more Celtic languages, it's off the fucking charts. Anyone who disagrees with me can go and look up a thing called kenning. Kenning. We're done. End of story. End of fucking story. Right? It's an ancient it's an ancient practice. Nobody can explain it on the planet Earth, in which a phrase or a statement, I'm thinking here about the Norse Edda, I'm thinking here about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. This is the stuff that fascinated Professor Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and C.S. Lewis. And by the way, all three of them were friends.
Right.
Oh, yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And Tolkien and C.S. Lewis said that of the three of them, in fact, of their entire friend, of their little group, Owen Barfield was the greatest thinker of the lot. Then you tell
Least
me.
well known.
That's right. How come he's not that well known? Oh, you don't want to find out. So just look up Canning and we're done. I don't have to say another word. In which ancient languages, certain phrases had 5 levels of meaning, each one different than the other, yet they all hinge on the one word. In other words, the sophistication, right, of these ancient languages is far excessive of what we've got today. And it boggles the mind. But I'll keep it simple. And it pertains to everything we're talking about, actually. And again, I'm paraphrasing Barfield, right? I'm saying it in my way. He said it in his own way, but it runs parallel. I'm always annotating these greats and shrinking down volumes and volumes of their work so that my audience can understand it, okay? So basically what he's talking about is that the metaphor is the key to all of this. He acknowledges that consciousness has this slippery aspect, but he's going to try and explain it by saying that if you then interrogate anything, like an identity, an object, and you find out that this is what's happening, that it's always like something else, and we see how much this word would be used in our language, and then you see that this concept of metaphor has arisen, and it's the essence of language, it's the heart of language. He then asked the ultimate question, then could it be that all these individual things that are always like something else, is there an original antitype that everything was like originally, back in time? So that instead of one thing being like another thing, because I would have to chase that, everything I go to the next thing to B, I need to go to C. If I go to C, I need to go to D. So this thing never ends. It's universal. So then he asked, if I pull back completely, what is it that all the things that are alike, what are they like? Is there an original something that is not like anything else, that all the other things are like? And when I go in to interrogate them, they point away from themselves to some other phenomena. It's like it's written in their DNA. And then, of course, this would be the same with the mind. In this case, then the problem of why the mind does it, it's not that much of a problem because everything's doing it. The mind is now just another, right, entity or identity that's doing the same thing, but it's not unique. Once I start getting into this metaphor thing, I find out that it's the rule for all creation, for all things, objects. Everything is like something else. I can't understand a cube unless I understand a sphere. Everything pointing to something else. And if I want to know the sphere, I have to know what a circle is. And if I have to know what a circle is, I need to know what a flat plane is. And you have to know what 3 dimensions are, right? And all it just goes on and on and on. And then I might have to turn back on myself and say, what is perception? What is dimension? What is illusion? What is reality? You see, the whole thing just carries on. Everything is like something else. So he asked the ultimate question, are all the individual things that we know and register, including our own minds, like something else that's been lost, like a lost wholeness? And that original thing wasn't like anything else. It was the antitype. And that, of course, then Barfield was a mystic and a Christian, right, who believed that there was a transcendent reality, because you can't answer this, of course, right, unless you now go to a metaphysical, and this was his case. This was his case for God. This was his proof of a transcendent reality, a metaphysical reality that we have fallen away from. There's echoes of Plato here, right, and so on. So
World of forms.
Yes, this was his answer.
Yeah.
That we don't know what that original thing was. but we can damn well know that it once existed, and that everything in history is a devolution or a fall from a state of perfection, and he referred to this as original participation. Original participation. But that got lost. Ancient man had it, and when he lost it, the loss was so absolutely terrifying and so all-encompassing that from that moment on, everything else in the whole universe became like it. We only had the shards. It's like a great mirror falling from a great height and then smashing into millions and millions of shards. But each of those shards contains the implicit holographic hallmark of its origin, even though it's a shattered piece. And this is how we get metaphor. Metaphor is the footprint that tells you this, but nobody wanted to listen to him. He got occluded. As usual, he was called a kook, right? And he just was not in the position of arguing with anyone. Yeah. So another one down the drain, another great forgotten genius, you see. Now I have an article on, maybe one day we'll talk about it, called Age of Idolatry. So maybe we'll talk about that in another program, because I was that was a little one to introduce his thought, but it came up here because of this idea. So the mind then ceases to be unique in the sense that it's not speaking directly about itself. It has the same origin. It came from a state of divine wholeness. And the split in the brain, right, the left, right, is just another example of that. But it's split in many ways. And this is why its own origin is elusive. That is why it is slippery when you try to inquire into it. As we said, it just doesn't work. It seems to be hermetically sealed. And this is one way to understand that. It is pointing to its origin. But since the origin has been completely lost, we do feel then that this is something that is uncanny and untoward and vague and unacceptable. Come on, mind, give us a concrete idea of what you are. But the mind cannot do that, nor can anything else, nor can language. It's just not up to it.
Yeah. Before we get further into this new trinity of the unconscious to the conscious and then to self-consciousness, I feel like there's one area of psychology or the structure of the psyche that we've maybe not fully covered over yet. We spoke quite a lot about the superego and the dictates of it, but we haven't spoke about one of these outer layers of veneers that hides the self, and that this is the persona. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the persona first, and then we'll get into this layer underneath of what the self is and of consciousness.
Yes, well, this is important, of course. Jung come up with the word persona. Freud didn't, but he knew all about it. I mean, Karen Horney, a neo-Freudian, called it the idealized image. The traditional explanation is just simply that this is the product of the superego. And this is why it's so difficult to deconstruct Freud and pretend that he didn't know what he was talking about, because then why have a persona? Why have this mask? Something within us wants us to conform with the status quo, right? Because remember, a lot of physical vitality and energy goes into creating this mask. So much so that most people, they are the mask, and only that. They're welded to it. Just go on OnlyFans or TikTok and look around. Just look at the people that you know.
Your politicians,
Fuck
for example, actors, celebrities.
Yeah, see? So the word persona just meant mask. But it is under the direction of the superego that he says you will have your anxiety lowered if you conform. And there is, remember, we also said that temporarily there is a sense of euphoria when the guilt is lowered. The guilt complex lowers. And so people adopt this mask by choice, and they want it, and they cling to it, and they invest it with a lot of energy. Because this is I call it the counterfeit self that runs around, and in the end, as we hinted earlier, man prefers it. Right? It gets him the cues, and it gets him the affectations. It wins him those 3 stripes, usually, right? Generally. And man prostitutes himself, and he goes cheap. And even though there's a little bit voice of the shame and all, it doesn't matter. He'll find ways of suppressing that. And most of his existence is then this uncomfortably numb feeling, but he'll just go along to get along. And he will adjust to an abnormal world, even knowing that it's abnormal. But he will lie to himself. He will maybe become slightly charitable. He might even enter into the political world, in his local community, all in order to give himself a feeling, oh, I know things are broken, but look at me. You see me? See me running around helping the poor? Right? There I am with my sign. Welcome, all Pakistanis. Welcome, all Somalians. Come on in. We'll give you plenty of free houses and loads of money. See, I'm doing something for the world. Flowers and speeches here. All right? See, so all of this is all related to what we're talking about. All the goody two-shoes crap. And the more that the person has the persona, and the more that the person knows that it's built on falsity, that it is a false construct, usually the more duplicitous and hypocritical and even ultimately hysterical they are. They become hysterical when they enter the crowd, because then these idiotic ways are amplified. You were seeing that now more than ever before, and thanks to the internet, thanks to people's cameras, it used to be hidden. You see, all of this was a little obscure. You didn't know quite, you could be fooled by thinking, well, this was the communist revolution when the proletariat rose up against their masters, and it was just something far away, and you didn't really get what was going on. It sounded all highfalutin. Now you can see it for the thugocracy that it is. All of that hoopla, is been fading away. People know it's just tripe. And institutions like the BBC and Harvard and all of these, it's all coming down. Thank goodness, because this is the good thing amidst all the chaos. It's actually good because the optics are brilliant. As George Orwell said, the left is the worst advertisement for themselves. And believe you me, he was right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Just need to spend time near them or look at them.
Yes.
Sure, we've got the footage now. It's all over the internet. You can
Yeah.
see it everywhere. You want to check it out. Like,
Yeah.
people are losing their minds left, right, and center.
They are
Yeah.
indeed howling. It's still howling at the moon, screaming
Yeah.
Trump derangement syndrome. But remember we said in the previous show that this narrowing of focus into a particular cause lowers anxiety. You're no longer having to think about the self that's screaming inside. If I focus outside as a hysteric, and by the way, the other three pathological conditions of schizoid, obsessive, and depressive also are ways of doing the same thing, but we're just focusing on the most extreme one, the hysteric. All those other three are also they're also coping mechanisms to stifle the voice of the self. But in this case, the hysteric one gets into the crowd, so the chaos and the cacophony, everybody's everybody's chanting from the same hymn sheet. Everybody has the same cause. And all of them are trying to narrow the focus into this cause very sharply so that lowers anxiety. They don't have to think about existential conditions of their internal being. It drowns it out. So this Trump derangement syndrome is a perfect living example of this. They're calling it obsessive. There's even actually one psychologist has said that 75% of his clients have got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's actually become
Only 75.
Yeah, only 75.
Yeah.
Especially the youth. But I'm thinking, why are they even in therapy in the first place? You don't have to tell me the condition that they've got. That these young people are coming and lying on your couch is already a problem. And I guarantee that most of them just want a quick fix medication. They're not there to talk about themselves. They're looking to get rid of the neurotic misery we talked about earlier, not the legitimate suffering. And then they will hang on Trump everything that they feel, all of it, all the harangues, all the complaints, all the criticism on one man, because that narrows, right? We have to make sure that everything we talk about is articulated to what's happening today. Otherwise, the audience just loses it. They think of this as some highfalutin thing. No. Every single point is visible to you. Your own daughters and sons are going to be caught up in it. Yeah, it's very, very personal.
Even just to give it like like one of these things that comes into the persona and people that over-identify it is a key characteristic of narcissism, which I think we'll maybe do a show by itself on, and maybe about the narcissist, the psychopath, and contrast that to the life of the sage in a way, which I know you've done on Unslaved before. But let's even just get into the persona of today. This is the people that sort of want to join institutions, become the politicians, the celebrity. They adhere to the woke ideology. And again, internally, they're screaming, everything's going wrong. They're, the depressives, they have these anxieties and all these different conditions. And so they go into the psychologist, as you say, they look for the label, then they can identify with the label and go, oh, that's what's wrong with me. I have a disease, like a fucking broken leg, or, of diabetes or something else, of something physically wrong with me. And he says, here's this label, here's the medication that goes along with that, here's all our science bullshit that proves it's going to work for you. And yeah, it's the outside world that's wrong. It's the Trump, it's those kind of men, it's the straight white man, that's the evil problem. And allows them then to project all of this inner angst and anxiety outward onto the enemy, onto the object of hatred. And then if they can direct it outwards, it means it's not turned inwardly. Not as much, but not always. Because eventually these people will break down. They're going to have their moment off that, I think, as well. But what we're going to get into in the article goes a lot further into this, behind the persona and what the self is, and about consciousness and the difference of, when you ask people the question, who am I? They'll come up with different labels and different words and phrases. But when you go into the article, it's not thought that's at the center of this, but feeling that's so essential. Do you want to speak a little bit about how feeling's at the center of consciousness? Or would you like me to read a bit more of the article and we can come up to that?
Yeah, that was a part I threw in because it turns out that the good part of modern science is this new discovery of feeling, a certain kind of feeling that they call interoception, being like an inner thermometer. But they have now realized that what we call thinking and knowing, are really sort of emanations of a deeper sense of feeling, in which we're constantly checking back on how we feel about everything. And this includes even about how we're feeling inside. There's a constant second by second, how do I feel? How do I feel? How am I feeling now? How do I feel? All the time going on automatically. And when the feelings are good and the thermometer is at the optimum, then we're happy. And when we're not, then things get out of hand. But what this has done is it has shown that this world of thinking and thought and cognition that we are involved in, you talked about the persona being sort of artificial. Well, that's right. We have lost touch with the feeling centers, and we've gone straight up into the thinking only. Again, courtesy of the left brain. You see, that this has happened. Now, some argue that women are still more in touch with their inner feelings about things. They still very attached, and that's because they raise children, and therefore they've got to project themselves into the child to know how is that child feeling. It could be a matter of life and death. So I not only have to feel how I'm feeling, I've got to be able to almost put that aside and feel for the child. Whereas the man, he's not involved in anything like that, right? So, and that, something, there may be a real case to that. But as women now stop giving birth and stop having good relationships, they too are falling foul of this problem. So there could be problems on the horizon about this, where this interoception is breaking down. And what it means, of course, is it's ready for a lot more pathology, because you don't know how you actually feel. You're losing something very, very fundamental to what it means to be a human. So the post-humanists just love this. They're bots, they're robots, right? Their cybernetic world that is coming thundering toward us. This is where they are, because these androids, these robots, they don't have any such thing as interoception and never will. They won't be able to introspect at all like a human being can. All these things, that these transhumanists don't tell you about. But they're able to grasp it because they themselves have lost this ability. They've become so wooden, or as Wilhelm Reich would have said, they become so armored and mechanical, right, that they can envision a world in which there's beings without this interoception. So I put that a little bit into the article as well, just to point out that, because this article was hinging on the idea of, if we can't get a proper account from the mind about selfhood, what it is to be a self, Maybe it's because it's not about thinking in the first place. Maybe language can't grasp it because it's not a thing to be thought. It's a thing to be felt. This would be one answer. It's not the ultimate answer. It's not very satisfactory, but it's a little bit a step in the right direction. The thing that we call selfhood is elusive. Remember, way back in the 1600s, David Hume, the philosopher, Scottish philosopher, said, there is no such thing as the self. When I sit down to contemplate my selfhood, it's just nothing there but a gas. Right, because he's thinking about it. He may have been a philosopher, but he didn't twig this actually thing that, has come up. So I put this in the article to show that new science, new physics, new science, new biology is moving, at least in this regard. God knows what they'll do to change it later, but this is really interesting stuff. So I addressed it for people who are interested in it, and they could look it up, interoception. And it's this idea that maybe the self is not something that is going to be the object of thought. It's the object of feeling. It's an object that we can say it, but actually what you're doing is you're really feeling it. And the knowing is more of a secondary derivative kind of grasping or estimation. Yeah, of course it is. And also, anyone who's suffered deeply damn well knows that they have a self. Nobody can go through any tragedy or deep, deep feeling. They can say, yeah, one day I was thinking about myself, and the other day I was really feeling hurt. You damn well know there's a self in there. So I would question the person. So I can't see a self. Yeah, have you actually any fucking suffered any time in your life? Because if you had, you'd soon know that there's a self in there doing the suffering. Come on. Ludicrous.
I think this is one of the things that Sam Harris gets caught up upon a lot. I know he's very into sort of these Eastern sort of religious teachings, which are sort of Gnostic, as you've touched upon before.
Yeah.
And I remember I used to listen to him a lot when I was younger with it. He was part of that new atheist movement, which became a bit of a craze online. But he was one of the only ones that sort of spoke about how there was a spiritual experience that could be had not within a religious context. And I find that interesting for itself. Obviously, he's went off the rockers for now. But I think what's happened to him, these techniques of the Eastern philosophies, you've described them as a kind of auto-hypnosis. And I think one of the insights one can gain from studying things like Buddhism and some of these things is what he describes as the illusionary nature of the self. And I think is what exactly we've been talking about, is when people think about the self, they're getting confused with the persona, and they're getting confused with the thoughts and the labels and the cognition about it. Whereas when one undertakes things like a meditative practice or goes into some kind of solitude or something like that, you get to understand the feelings at the center of it. And so you can't convey that fully to other people. You can only use this metaphor. And that's what he means by there is no self. But instead of that, what he's substituting in is the institutions and the voice of the collective. And so that's why he goes along fully with it. And that's what's taken him so off track. But have you any thoughts on that there? Maybe a little bit more yourself, or?
Yeah, well, these are the organization men who have learned to sing from the same hymn sheet. They're not mystics, and they are deeply collectivized in their own being, right? They're pathological types. They haven't even listened. See, I don't need to bring up any of the mystical theories to counteract them at all. You just have to cite other men in their own institutions that they have openly ridiculed and suppressed. Yeah, bringing up the other guys is too much. Like you said, Alan Watts and people like that, right? 10 times smarter than any of these guys. No, these are people's champions. These are the donkeys who kick lions to death, right? That's all they are to me, just hee-hawing donkeys who have this, they're high priests of the materialistic paradigm. Very little of what they have to say is important. The stuff that they're good at is when they contradict and fight the religious types and show the error in some of these ghastly religious types who also deeply exploit people. And, this can be in the West or can be in the East. So to that degree, the Christopher Hitchens types, their critical abilities are good. They're showing you the obscenities and the liberties that these towelheads in the East and even these evangelists in the West, take. There's something good there. And the ultimate then goal of the atheist is to say, drop all that shit and just be a good human. Just be a humanitarian who tries to do the most moral good, and the least evil. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm perfectly okay with people like that. But that I just don't believe that it ends there, you know. And when they repeat these things about the self that you spoke about, they're just reiterating what David Hume and John Locke and some of these other guys have mentioned. And they get away with it because very few of their audience have read the other people that are the anti-materialists. They don't read them. They don't read the George Berkeleys and the William Blakes and the Gabriel Marcells or the Soren Kierkegaards. They just don't. And they settle for these very, very simple explanations, most of which have been already debunked, by the way. You and I have already talked about, the ideas of John Locke. He's one of the founding fathers of materialism. It's just nonsense. We've talked about behaviorism, right? That was knocked on the head. But these were paradigms that held sway for a long, long time. They still do. But then you have very, very intelligent dissenters from within. You've got all these quantum scientists who've rejected materialism. You've got Kurt Gödel, one of the greatest mathematicians that ever lived. He showed incredible revelations that certainty was not going to come from the mathematical logic that was all the rage. You had Thomas Kuhn, who talked about paradigm shifts, also showing you the deep flaws in the scientific method. You had Karl Popper, who talked about falsification. It goes on and on and on, where people from within their own institutions have rocked the boat. So it's good to know about those people. Then you move on to these plasma cosmologists like Hanna Alfvén from Sweden, and your Carl Pribhams and all the people I mentioned in my articles, who talk about holographic universe or these other theories that show you that the universe did not arise from no Big Bang, and all of these alternative thinkers. I have an article called Mysticism, Truth or Falsity, and I list many of the greatest thinkers, your Raymond Tallises and, like I say, others that are of the non-materialistic school. Yeah. But when I spoke to you before about the loss of the German idealistic school, and how that was all suppressed and a lot of intrigue went into Britain with its Hobbesian, Baconian, this is still going on today, you see. They haven't given up the ghost. Yeah. The paradigms that they created are still largely in place. When they canceled the British idealists, and of course they got rid of the German idealists, even had 2 wars against Germany and a massive long campaign of propaganda, and then they disfigured it. They got the French deconstructionists and people like that to horrendously repackage, these Hegel's, taking huge parts out of his work, but then sort of messing it all up and then rescripting it with their name on it, knowing that nobody's going to know that they've done it or they won't see it. And so it's what I call scavenger research, most of it. But then what they do is they piled on the degrees. They gave Jacques Derrida a complimentary award, and literally hundreds of American scientists wrote petitions denying. I think it was Columbia or Princeton that gave it to him, this honorary degree. And it was challenged by many, many American thinkers, yet they went ahead anyway. Yeah. So within the institutions of science, there was even people who said this man should never be honored in this way, and yet the institutions still went ahead and made sure that he would be, given this honorary degree, which did no end for his fame, you see? Put him on the map. And other people were just horrified. Some of the most eminent philosophers in America were horrified by this, but they went ahead anyway, you see? So this is just under the table, disingenuous stuff. They made him trendy. They made him trendy amongst the young, the youth, who's always looking for. So these are these postmodernists. But again, the best way to deal with these materialists is just simply to sharpen your own critical ability, look at their own theories, and show the flaws in it. Yeah. Even if you don't know the great minds yet, just try to look at areas in which they themselves have, flawed logic. Then move on to the Michael Cremos, the Bruce Liptons, the Sheldrakes, and the McGilchrists, and these amazing people like Dr. Stuart Hameroff and others, right, who are making a monkeys out of their whole paradigm. That's when the real education begins. Yeah. But these are high priests backed by the media. They come on with the sound bites. They have best-selling books, spinner racks, crap, And if you're not thinking very hard and you haven't done your homework, they will espouse this kind of Darwinistic approach and never really tell you the facts. We've just alluded to one. None of them can explain why something that evolved over many, many, many millennia is so absolutely defunct. That's language. Apparently defunct, if you take their model, because everything that evolves is meant to gain more sophistication. All the bad versions are meant to have already died off. And the perfect version, of course, is meant to be the one that's at the end of the journey. Well, language totally defies that. And as Barfield showed, this is because it has to be that way. Because the answers are non-materialistic. They are metaphysical. They are transcendent realities. And if you keep leaving that out like these guys do, then don't expect you to have your answers. But you know what they do? They go, well, all right, but we don't want to have our towers burning. We've invested a lot in this. We've got a thing called group narcissism. Ha ha ha. What's that? Group narcissism? How many people can define that for you? Yeah. They want to talk about cults. The DeGrasse Tysons and the Sam Harrises will sneer at St. John of God and some other fucking crazy motherfucking cult. They're a cult. It's one cult screaming at the other cult. You are a cult leader, you fucking asshole. Yeah. And by God, if you had half a chance, you'd even be worse. God knows where you're trying to lead the human race. You see, when I spoke earlier of interoception, do you realize that how they fought tooth and nail to deny the emotions and feelings were important to the human race? These material. It was all about thinking. It was all about the critical ability. It was all about objectification. Right? Now, their own science has proven that centuries and centuries of their own science is bogus. Same with the quantum science at the turn of the century. The towers have been burning ever since. Yeah. I don't even know how they can carry on with straight faces, to tell you the truth. And there's a lot more besides that we could talk about. They've discovered amazing things, but this was an important one because, again, they always mocked and laughed at feeling. If you were feeling type and you try to, oh, that's all romantic, that's all artistic. We don't have anything to do with that. We're into cold logic.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Sam's a real guy for his hatred of intuition. I have heard many times he rants about intuition, about how bad it is. And again, it's just one of these things of just shutting himself down to turn outward again then once more. But we've really spoke about the importance of feeling and understanding consciousness and understanding the self. Would you speak a little bit about, the difference of feelings that a man gets from being a part of the crowd compared to being one of the outsider? And then maybe we'll get into a little bit about how the suppression of feeling is one of these main mechanisms that the architects of control use. Because we see it in so many different ways around us, whether that's through, this excess eating or the different medications or the constant stimulus from the media and all these different sort of gadgets and whatnot. What are your thoughts about that and how the architects of control suppress feeling maybe, and maybe the difference between the outsider and the crowd man?
Good point. Good point. Because remember, although we've just talked now about this new science that's looking at that, and it does come from eminent sources, don't mistake me. They're not going to change their paradigm because of it. This is an important. Well, McGilchrist's work is important. Has anything changed in science when he came up years ago? No. Sheldrake's work on morphogenic fields, I could name many. Way back when the holographic theory came to light, has that changed any paradigms? No. See, they just marginalize. It's the same with this new discovery in the neuroscientific world. The same men who discovered this thing about feeling have also spoken about the polyvagal system. That should have already made a revolution in what we know about biology. It hasn't. It came and went. They've spoken about what was the other thing? Very, very important thing. Jesus, it just slipped my mind. But there's been other discoveries by some of the same coterie, each one in their own way earth-shattering, you see?
Ian McGilchrist, the whole about the right brain, the sort of intuitive thinking, the macro picture, the
Yeah,
holistic sort of way. Yeah,
that's right.
yeah, all of
All
that
of that
with
would
it
shake
is,
you up if you
yeah.
knew about it, right? It'd be
Mm.
amazing. I guess, as I say, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, there's can really get into this and find out how many earth-shattering paradigms there are. But never does it change. The status quo remains, it trudges along, relentless, crushing everything under its, yeah, they're not so easy to take down, sadly. They're institutionalized, and they have a whole system in place to make sure that they police out any young, fertile mind, you see, that looks like they're reading the right stuff. Darwinism is in a shoddy state. It's falling apart at the seams. They don't want you to know about any of the things that contradict it. There's some brilliant authors out there that would just tear it to shreds, and so on. Yeah, but many of these guys, like you're talking about, Sam Harris, his wife is a Buddhist, you see, so they have a weird dark side in which they or their cohorts and friends are often very deeply immersed in this Eastern palaver, because they have worked it out that, yes, some Eastern paths are down on the self, right? And they believe there's no self. These are this Eastern nonsense, right? And so they think that they found a home. These high priests like a certain amount of this jive, and their wives do, particularly, right? So they go along with it. It's a new trend. They're into the new age. They're into these exotic paths from the East. I have no time for it. All of that stuff boils down to, basically, as you mentioned earlier, auto-hypnotism, and one can get into all of that, about how that works. But one look objectively at their culture and the utter poverty, the Gnostic elements, of the hatred of the body and the hatred of the world, immediately should put an intelligent person, a really intelligent person, onto it, that this is not for us. It's not for the West. This was born in darkness. It was already born in corruption, because if you actually get into it, you'll find out that the pre-Vedic, this is going way back, before 6,000 years, you'll find out it was a very different thing. And it's only when the Puranas and the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Shastras were written that now you get the control of the priest, who immediately start to misinterpret the earlier, what I would call pre-Vedic teachings. But nobody in the whole wide world has read any of that stuff. They don't care to go in and look at it. And so they just, go with India from this post-Vedic period. And it's nothing but lies. But it's all decorated up to look real holy. Some amazing work has been done. But this is all under the power of the priest. You see? But man needs the authority. See, along with this persona that you talked about, comes this need to secure it. The persona is a pretty shaky thing on the individual level, and it's no different on a collective level. But then, remember, we also said that the superego that helps create this persona, a section of the superego, is called the ego ideal. And then that's both, it's ambivalent as well. It seeks for heroes. And of course, the parents usually are installed, unless they're bloody terrible people, right? But sometimes, sadly, even if they are terrible people, the child doesn't know that and is still embodying the parents as the first heroes. But on a good day, you do seek for legitimate heroes. But on a bad day, you seek for heroes and they're not really heroic at all. And they're there as these figureheads which will help secure, your mask. You see, in other words, you choose wrongly. Now, don't we see that the media is expert at producing these Frankenstein, these horrors that we might easily, attach to? Been going on since the beginning of the media. It could be a pop icon, Jimmy Savile, Gary Glitter. I don't know what look at Beyonce and Britney Spears. I mean, it really doesn't take very much. But Now it's the Kardashians and P. Diddy, tomorrow will be some other obscenity, you see. And this works. Yeah, because there's a natural, like I say, all the people at the top of the ladder know everything we're talking about here. So they know exactly what temperature it is inside your being, and they know how to throw up a particular kind of persona. And the second meaning of that word, it's actually a persona, a person, a people's champion. And they're very sophisticated at being able to do this. And we follow them. They're the Pied Pipers. And then the last thing I'd say, because it's very deep, I've written an article called Stilling the Mind. If you link up to that, it'll really take you through it. But just in conclusion, don't forget that when the worldly Western person is glutted, we talked about them being gluttons for sensational titillation. And then a point comes where they find out to their absolute horror that the world is not, in fact, a perpetual carnival of delights. That's every time the more that you indulge in sensual pleasure, the less and less satisfying it becomes. This is not what when you sign on in the beginning that the outsider, he works it out right away. But the other types we're talking about, they don't get this. So they're walking into a trap that he never gets into because he didn't fall for this in the beginning. He was a good observer of life and he knew it doesn't work like that. Or his high is more going to the umwelt, to nature. And there it is unlimited. Because that's a mirror of the self, not a mirror of the persona. So this all has to be pointed out. But the Johnny who is going towards the sensual, episodic, he's an episodic. Well, look, there's absolutely millions of people as we speak in that mess right now. So naturally, one of the reactions to them discovering this, they go through what they call a dark night of the soul. It's not, but to them it is. It's the first hiatus. It's the first pit stop. It's the first moment where things are on a downer. Hey, let's go to the rave. Let's go to the party. No, it's the first moment where they're jaded, bored, and everything. Now, a certain coterie of these people, finding to their horror that this is the case and that they cannot bring meaning from within, go east. Right? They pick up a book. They watch some garbage documentary with that cartoon whispering like a fucking little snake, right, to you. And they hear this idea that if you get rid of the self, Matty, all anxieties disappear. It's because I'm an I, and I have this thing called self that all the suffering and pain in my life is caused by, and has been since I was a little kid. But if I can get rid of this I, and they know how to do it, they know how to. I learned that. I'll just get my ass over there. Just gonna save up and get a ticket. They will remove this pesky problem. I see the light. I get it. What? I'm on my fucking way. Get rid of these clothes. Get a few beads. Put some ashes on my head. Right? Yeah, yeah. And head the fuck over there to the Ganges and find some towel head. And he'll teach me the techniques of counseling the self. And I've even heard somebody like Sam Harris talk about the self as an illusion. Now, I've glutted this self like a pig, like a fucking hog all my life. And I only change when I find the trough is empty. Not for a legitimate reason. No. It's because I have plundered the world to find out it's empty. Now I'm a sannyasi. Now I'm a sadhu. Now I'm a renunciate. Now I want a new costume. If there's a God, he's weeping. This is fucking tragedy. It is absolutely horrendous. This has nothing to do with spirituality. But these Eastern motherfucking sanctimonious charlatans over there watch you coming, white boy. And they're thinking of this. They know, oh my God, it's so sophisticated. They live like billionaires, right? They're pedophiles. They're foul. But they know a few words, few little, chants, and the techniques of auto-hypnotism, which, by the way, as I said, these priests, since the early days of the post-Vedic, we're talking thousands of years ago, they've had time to refine these techniques of auto-hypnotism. They've had plenty of time to open many schools, cults, and sects to test it. India is just filled with shrines and temples where they've been rehearsing this. So along comes your idiot, your chump, the schmuck, right? And they come from every Western culture. Yeah. It's just it's a grist mill. And I was part of it, so I got to see it from the inside, you know. It eats you up. It just eats you up. And it's exotic because it's only exotic because, again, it has this promise of egolessness, whatever the fuck that means, right? Yeah. And again, there's also this very euphoric feeling because the techniques that they teach you, remember we said that if you narrow your focus, it lowers anxiety? They are the past masters at that. Half the meditation techniques are only doing that. They're just lower anxiety. They're not taking you to any spiritual realms. All they're doing is removing the anxiety of being a self. So they're doing the same thing as Big Pharma does on this side, or some other garbage on this side that lowers the quotient of neurotic misery. They don't have the technique of doing it, you see? It's just like when a child is crying and you distract it with some sweets or toys, it'll stop crying and immediately get absorbed. It's nothing more than that. They absorb you with a lot of Indian mystical shit. You know, and for a while that works, and it distracts you, and it lowers the hypertension, and it lowers your anxiety, and you feel high. So now you become addicted to it. It's the same with John of God. It's just, over in Mexico or fucking South America, or whatever. Every one of these people does the same thing. But we're willing to prostitute ourselves to any one of them.
Mm.
We can't tell the genuine fake from the genuine article.
Yeah. And I think a whole part of their techniques, it's about dissociation in a way. It's about a denial of the self and about the denial of your own feelings. And this disattachment then leads to that sort of feeling of elation that sort of comes along with it also. But it's all about the aesthetic life. It's about denial of food, about denial of X, Y, Z, any emotions that come into you. These are just Maya. These are illusions. These are things that attach you to the material world, the real world. And we spoke a little bit about their persona and how people become attached to the persona. And again, this is another way of sort of abetting by the dictates of the superego. And this, again, furthers the repression of the self. One of the things that help people see through the persona, I can't remember his name now at the top of my head, but he was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers. He had a great little sort of saying that I came across. It was, "No man can step into the same river twice, for it's never the same river, and he's never the same man." And I wanted to bring that up because it's okay to learn some things, like you can let go of different labels and different ways of sort of cognition and thinking. And we spoke a little bit more about the different layers of the psyche and how to get in touch with the self and through the shadow work. And one of the things we come into contact with are the archetypes. And the archetypes, whenever you come into contact with them, evoke different kinds of feelings. We spoke with the word numinous before that has came up multiple times as well also. And we spoke a little bit about the tarot and how we can use the tarot maybe to help to communicate with these archetypes or evoke different kinds of feelings as well so that we can learn from them. Can you speak a little bit more about what the actual Western way of dealing with this conundrum is, of how to know the self compared to these sort of illusionary techniques of the East?
Yeah, well, you see, that's right. And by the way, it was Heraclitus that came up with that.
That's it.
Fantastic.
I've been racking my head for 20 minutes trying to figure.
Yeah, he was an important guy.
Okay.
Very, very important, along with Parmenides and Anaximander. But
Yeah.
Western techniques, again, are very varied. And often they can go wrong too. Remember, it was from the West that we got this Gnosticism.
Yes.
So it's not that the West is entirely a pure system. There's a lot of garbage. I mean, didn't we say that materialism, for instance, right, came out of the West? Yeah. So one then has to study the mystical way. And this would then take on, you'd be more interested then in your German mystics and your Italian mystics like Pico della Mirandola, Marsilio Ficino. I've mentioned them. There's a site I have called shellingzone.com. And believe you me, I've got a page there, a library page, where I list all these German mystics leading up to the German idealists. And that's it. And I've written a book on it called Schelling, Understanding German Idealism. It's a primer book, for people who are beginning. And we've done a numerous amount of podcasts on Enslaved about it too. And so there's the legitimate Western philosophical tradition. Now, granted, it too has been misinterpreted by some later American people who want to disfigure it. So you do have problems there as well. But this, as I said, this tradition became popular in England with Coleridge, the poet we said, brought it over. And for a while, for a very, very short time, it was of interest, and Owen Barfield was in that tradition. Wordsworth, Coleridge, a few others. Rudolf Steiner would have been into it as well, Goethe. Then it reached America with your transcendentalists. This would be Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman. People can look these words up. And so this was a tradition. These are traditions based on the German idealistic tradition. And as I said, these guys were answering a lot of these German idealists, for instance, were not only inspired by these German mystics, and they would be Jakob Bohm, Meister Eckhart, and Nicholas Cusa, and the others I mentioned on the website, but they were also really also answering Plato in many ways when you talked about the ancient Greeks here, right? So a great deal of the work of the idealists was to give more body to the Platonic teachings. And of course, Plato was a believer in the transcendent. He was a metaphysician and a rationalist. And so this then is the important Western tradition, so to speak, right? And you have fantastic figures like, for those who are more mathematically minded, you would have somebody like Alfred North Whitehead, who for many years was a colleague of Bertrand Russell, the uber materialist, and positivist. But as time went by, Alfred North Whitehead started to question positivism and materialism, and he basically jumped ship, and he moved from England to America, became a professor, over there. I think it was in Princeton or something like that, right? And he completely changed. He became an idealist in the Schellingian tradition. And so he then is a very, very important thinker in terms of, he focused on the origins of the universe, and some of the higher mathematics. And his work is absolutely essential if you're into the sciences. You'll be completely changed. Oh yeah. And then he's part of a group that then evolved into what you have now as a very small group in academia today. Because I keep bashing academia, but look, it's not all bad, right? There are some positive little enclaves. And one of them is called religious naturalism. Religious naturalism, people can look that up. And it's also known as naturalistic pantheism. It's the same group, naturalistic pantheism. So these are very interesting modern trends, because when people like me talk, or when I talk, I'm usually referring to something, that was hundreds of years ago. And sometimes people can just think, well, then this has nothing to do with modern times. Wrong. And it's my own fault. I'm so caught up in those guys that I sometimes forget to mention that there are modern schools today, like I mentioned, this polyvagal school. But naturalistic pantheism or religious naturalism is something that people should look into. And a lot of it comes from Charles Hartshorne and also from this Alfred North Whitehead trend. And they came to America and they tried to counterbalance this positivistic, trend that was growing enormously in England through the Bertrand Russell School, and that entered into America through what's known as the analytical school. We've talked about that. And this is a very, very negative, this is where American philosophy is rooted. And so these are two trends. I call it mystical naturalism for people, who That's my term for it. But I would definitely recommend. Now, Whitehead's work is quite advanced, so it's more for those who have a good grasp of the mathematics. That maybe have a deeper understanding of that, which many of my listeners do. So I think they'll find it absolutely fascinating. And luckily, there's quite a lot online about him. Yeah, I mean, we have to fight it. This wokeism is huge, and it's even infiltrating. It has infiltrated psychology. It is also infiltrating philosophy deeply. And by the way, sadly, it's also infiltrating idealism,
Hmm.
the woke agenda.
Do
Yeah,
you, hmm.
which is not a
Do
good.
you think it's peaked? By
Yeah,
the way, out of curiosity.
yeah, it could
Yeah,
be. I mean, it's so absurd that
it's hard to say.
it's absurd. So you think it would finally, pop. And there are brilliant men out there, believe you me. I feature them on all my blogs and stuff like that who are knocking it for six, this wokeism. So it's not that it doesn't have good opposition, it does. And I try to feature those people, on my Substack and what have you, right? There's some very, very good thinkers out there taking it down. And it is possibly, but see, it's so necrophilous that what I try to do is focus on its origin, not where it's going, but where did it come from in the first place? And there's a political answer to that, with world socialism and Fabianism and Marcuse. There's a whole physical etiology, but there's also then the psychological aspect that you and I have been mostly talking about persona, about conformity. And with the wokeism, because it is so feral and because it's so libertine and uncivil, it's, I think that you can nail it when you understand that it is this mass regression to the years before the superego control comes in. There's no other way to explain it. Really isn't. Because as long as the superego is there, you're going to obey the rules of society. So when you see those being flaunted, when you see that coming apart, it has to be textbook regression. So the howling and screaming, the hair pulling, the flaunting of rules and regulations. And from these are middle class people. These are people who normally of a day would be completely adjusted, smashing windows, running into restaurants and causing havoc, throwing paint on things, and attempting to even become violent. This assassination culture and all of this. All of this is this polymorphous move. Yeah. So we have to look at it. Now, I've explained elsewhere also that, see, Plato, one of Plato's similes, very famous simile, is the simile of the cave, the allegory of the cave, in which a bunch of people it's very well known to philosophers, right? And there's lots of different people interpreting it. So it's about the human race being chained up and only able to focus on the wall of a cave in which they see nothing but shadows. And those shadows are, thrown by some real life things happening in the background. And behind them is a light or a fire that casts these shadows. And Plato is saying that the human race is really caught in this shadow play, and he called those the appearances. And nobody's able to turn their heads and look at what's actually casting those shadows. They don't see the real, because there's a fall has taken place and something's happened with the vision, and you get these images on the cave wall, and therefore you're always going to be in a kind of a doubt, while you're in the material world. Now, I've always used that simile in a slightly different, odd way, and that is to link it with another teaching of Aristotle, Plato's disciple, who came later, and where Plato's focus was being, Aristotle's focus was becoming. And the process of becoming obviously has to do with time, right? I mean, it's a temporal process. And the ancient Greeks knew it as telos, which is short for teleology, right? This endless process of becoming. And our minds got used to it, this unfolding. And we realized at some point that perceptual ability, just the act of seeing, wasn't enough. It's just a start. Because in this timeline, there's always this thing called the tomorrow. There's always a tree gets planted as a little sapling, and then it's going to grow into a mighty oak. But then it also may lose its leaves, get old, and rot, you know. And also don't forget that there's different seasons. The tree is not the same, right? So I can use perception, but I can also use conception. I can conceive in order to jump this gap. In fact, man found it that when he does this, it's actually very helpful to him. Okay, he gets it wrong a lot of the time, maybe even up to 50%. But what man's focused was, I also get it right 50% of the time. When I conceive about how a thing is going to come out, I sometimes get it wrong, but I also get it right. Hey, and that's good enough to go. So now the mind developed this conceptual ability to leap forward in time to the end goal and say, I think this is going to work. I think it'll come out this way. And then, as the centuries passed, you also gained experience, which also helped in this process because now you have even a greater grasp of how a thing will come out because you've seen it before. So man said, hey, we're onto a pretty good thing. It's not foolproof, but my God, in this uncertain universe, this is good. And so conceptuality grew to preempt, to jump over the gap of time to make up. Realizing there is this thing called time, and we're going to build this into our mental understanding so that we can do things in the material world better, rather than just being, it's where the reason, it's an attribute of the reason. Animals don't have it. Some do in a kind of an instinctual way, but we have it in a much, much more sophisticated way. Okay, what does this all have to do with the shadows on the cave wall? The thing is that a point comes when we discover in this telos that as far as every one of our lives is concerned, the future for us is always open-ended, right? So the mystery is, you don't need a supernatural mystery. There's always a mystery of who we're going to become tomorrow. Yeah. Built in to the very telos, the very teleology of life itself, in the time. In fact, anyone who doubts this is a fool because everyone can testify it never came out the way I thought it was going to come out. I didn't come out the way I thought I was going to come out. Every human being learns this. So what happens is a certain group of people, we know them as the progressives, and no word has been more abused in our society than that word.
The regressives.
Yeah, right. These are people who finally get majorly frustrated with this mystery that can never, ever be erased. Now, the thing is that there's a couple of ways to deal with it. One is to become so obsessive compulsive that you narrow your focus so that you can kind of predict who you will become. You try to make it so that your life is under so much strict superego control that you can, or what you'll do is you'll raise the bar. You will be more certain. It's all born out of fear, of course, right? But what you're trying to do is compensate for the open-endedness of your life, this precipice, like the fool in the tarot deck. You asked about the tarot cards, right? The fool is stepping off the edge. We don't like that. We want there to be a fixed road and a map. And it's a very, very, very deep fear. Yeah. And for some people, this fear becomes really pathological. And we're surrounded by them today. This fear has always been there, but it's now becoming even more. Historically speaking, it's a syndrome. Now, so one action is to make your life so paved, so predictable, so conformist, right? That you can kind of get a vague idea of who you're going to become tomorrow, and the vagaries are kind of erased. So you get the organization man, you get the urban environment, you get the predictability, you get the need to jump through the hoops, right? All of these superego things that are meant to off-put these shadows. This is how I can interpret the shadows. The shadows on the wall is just a mystery, something that you only half understand or see. Well, that's our future. The shadows on the wall are everyone's future, everyone's personal future self. And we don't like it. And the other thing that you can then do is worse than what I just described, and that is completely stop. Right? So imagine that the telos is not just a straight line of time, but it's slightly tilted. So that telos is actually a movement where it's rolling on an incline. Otherwise, how would you have the motion to keep going? It's not so somebody would say, is it will? Now, if it's will, that's fine. Maybe it is for a lot of people, right? The active, fearless kind of person wills it. He moves himself from behind, in other words, he's forcing himself forward. Then there's other philosophers who say, I can add another component to that. There's a transcendent self, a higher self that seduces you forward from the front. These are two schools. The philosopher Fichte, Johann Fichte was one of these. He talked about the transcendent self. And yes, although it is a very elusive thing, we are actually being called from the future by the higher self. He still believed there was this incline, but the movement is a pull, not a push. Other philosophers believe there's both. We're just dissecting it. Is it a movement from something in the back, pushing you forward into change and into the future? Or is it a lure from the front? Nobody's going to be able to decide. These are mysteries. It could even be a bit of both. But one of the solutions is then to make the thing so damn predictable that you reduce the anxiety of the path forward. And that then answers a lot about the organizational type of rigid person. In modern times, another reaction to this is equally, or if not more pathological, where you just stop. The mystery of the future becomes so intimidating to you as a being, so frightening, that you don't continue on the path of the fool. You stop. You don't even regress. That might happen later, but your intention, of course, is to remain static. This is well known to psychologists, right? So, but to disguise it, since I've always maintained that people are self-deceptive, you call yourself a progressive in a supreme act of self-deception. So what you've actually done is you've pulled up the tracks completely. You put a bomb on the tracks ahead and you've blown them up, and your train has just come completely to a standstill. But nobody in their right mind is going to admit that they're that necrophilous, that they've been that they are haters of wisdom, that they're misosophists, and that they're haters of reality. Nobody will admit that openly. So what you do is you believe that you're doing another kind of progress. And you team up with a bunch of other hysterics in the thugocracy, and you say, look what we're doing. And you make a lot of noise, wave a lot of placards, dredge up a bunch of useless causes. This is the Alice in Wonderland's kitchen. In order to disguise to other people that you are absolutely static. But you can't let people know that. So you buzz around like a busy bee with a lot of other fucking busy bees and act like you're the busiest thing on this planet. And everybody will believe you. It takes an incredible psychological insight to see, what's been going on here.
Just to make sure I'm following up correctly with it. So we have this telos, we have this pulling forward from, say, the higher self or the transcendent self. Part of that's going to be done by with this growth of consciousness that occurs over time that we've been describing with our sort of psychological lens. It's this kind of path of individuation, as Jung calls it, and it's an overcoming of the persona. And along that path, there is this suffering of trying to become this future self that your transcendent self is pulling you towards. And an element within it is freedom. And we were speaking about the opposite type, the crowd man, who has this pulling forward, but they're so wedged onto their persona, they're so ingrained or entranced by the superego that they don't want to let it go because they get the elation that comes from with it. And instead of being pulled forward by the ideal of the higher self, it's the crowd, it's the institutions that give them the alternative to latch onto. Yeah. What, have you any further thoughts onto it really with it? Or how does freedom play into this, and how these people have a hatred of freedom as a part of that also?
Yeah, that's another huge subject. We'll have to do it on another program. But,
Yeah.
and we will though, because I am a big believer in freedom and how it fits. But it would take too long to explain now. Let's do that next time. But you're right. The crowd is a manifestation of those who are really rather static. Yeah. They've pulled over at a certain station. They've dynamited the tracks. And for them, telos is at an end psychically. So they're rotten. They're rotting inside. Because anything that remains static, right, will rot. There's no movement. Now, life demands that movement. Life demands the telos. So these are necrophilous beings who want to contradict the laws of nature, the natural law or the moral order, right? And we have them now epidemic. I've spoken about it even with you before about how the solar world is poisoned by all these betas and feminine types. It's the same thing we're talking about. The more and more they enter in, the more and more the solar world itself becomes poisoned. It becomes even poisoned because these betas can't even produce children. A lot of them don't even want to produce children. They don't want marriages. They don't want a home. They don't want a home life. It's all the stasis I'm telling you about. It takes on many manifestations. But in any case, they are not capable of being paternal because they've lost the telos. The telos is the shadows on the wall that scare the shit out of them. Something unknowable, something uncanny about life. Plato spoke about it in his way, but I can easily map the simile of the cave, over this, things that are happening today. So what we're talking about here is a kind of courage. We won't talk about freedom, but let's change it just to speak about courage. In order to continue, these guys are not doing that, but in order for another man to continue, you need courage. Telos does require getting up, dusting yourself off again when you've reached a obstacle, and carrying the fuck on. See, an alpha father, somebody who would be a goodly father, he doesn't want his son or daughter to just become passive receivers of the perks of the solar world. He wants to help them maintain the solar world, to improve its flaws, to fix it when it needs to be fixed, to contribute, and not to be just a passive receiver of its already built-in goodies. So to do that, he's going to have to teach his children how to be self-sufficient. See, but how can you do that when in an urban environment now? Used to be easy when you lived on the farm. But still, even though you're living in an urban environment, the masculine father or the masculine mother is going to prepare their child to be totally self-sufficient. So they're less likely to need a persona to fit in. Because I'm self-sufficient. I don't need to kowtow to every fucking clueless, constitutional, moral inferior. Right? Which I do need to do if I'm working at Walmart where I'm fucking passive and I need, I need the crowd, I need their help, I need the welfare, I need, well, then you have to fit in. Then you're a non-entity. So you sit there eating the Doritos, getting fatter and fatter because you're burning with animosity and hatred, and your poor children are going to be the receivers of all of that. And then you are not bringing them up to be self-sufficient. You're bringing them up to be the docile body. And then you're telling them, here's a hero. Here's some gun-toting gangsta rapper. He's your hero. Because, the ego ideal is looking for a hero. But it's not a really positive, archetype. It's something transgressive. But the worst version has dynamited the tracks. He's worked out that the telos must die. We said when we looked at the ones who are going towards the east, they kill the self. They dynamite the self. They pop it out of it. They listen to Sam Harris or somebody or some Eastern mystic who goes, there's no such thing as the self. And even if there is the self, it is the source of all your problems. Come over here. I will teach you how to kill it. And they're right. They know to push that button because they got you. Because you do, in your own mind, understand this equation. If I wasn't a self, I wouldn't suffer. But as Freud said, yeah, there is legitimate misery, and I can understand you wanting to get rid of that, the neurotic misery. But there's also legitimate suffering, which is the very core of your humanity. I don't want to medicate it out of existence and then replace it with artificial happiness. And I don't need you towel heads to also teach me the techniques of auto-hypnotism so that I can bring it to silence, all these grandiose terms. Nor do I then say, well, fuck, I'm not into that, but I'm going to dynamite, I'm going to be one of these postmoderns. I'm going to spit on the tradition of my elders in the past, because that has no meaning for me, no value. And I am just exhausted, you see, with the rush, the movement of life itself. It's like the tree saying, I don't want to blossom, I don't want to grow. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
bird
necrophilic,
doesn't want to fly. Yeah,
that's it. The bird, the eagle doesn't want to leave the chicken coop, right? And so you have you talked about freedom. Here's one anecdote of freedom. You have the freedom to do so. There's nothing determined about this. These are all choices a man can make. We'll say that much about it. You have the freedom to say, want to escape from freedom. The rush, the velocity, the movement alone, I understand. It's moving my legs. Either something's pulling me from the front or something's pushing me from behind. I don't care. I'm done with this momentum. I've got to stop. And this urge becomes so great that now you go out and you become a cancel culture creature. Now you become one of these, the brats running around, fighting everything. Nobody swats you. Nobody stops you. Everybody thinks you got some, because you got a cause, right? You're wearing a t-shirt. Everybody is so dumb. And remember, half the people watching are not too far from you. You're permitted to do all of this because actually even the people around you aren't that much better. They're just a couple of steps away from being like you. Secretly. See, the outsider is a rarity. Most people are at some point closer to these feral SJWs than you can imagine. It only takes the right amount of, it's very, very simple. We've even spoken about what's happening to these 10, 11, 12-year-olds, right, in terms of the persona. Oh, that girl's cuter than me. Look at her. She's slim. She's good looking. She's intelligent, whatever. And that's enough to be, committing suicide. But the suicide can also be collective. It can be it could be a meme that the crowd gets into its head. And I'm telling you that that's what postmodernism is. That's what progressivism is. That's what this deconstructionism is. When you say nothing has any meaning, no words, language doesn't have meaning. Yeah, to you it doesn't have any meaning because you don't have any fucking meaning. Of course, you're right. It doesn't have any meaning. Once you've killed off the very telos, that is the essence of the life force. What, are you going to tell me now that language has meaning? You've killed the very heart of what it means to be alive. Naturally, everything else will rot in your worldview. Nothing will, it'll just be atoms colliding. Everything will just be accident. Nothing will have any meaning. And you become necrophilus. And hopefully, you can also team up with enough of you to even change society itself, to make it more necrophilus. And it lacks defenses. It doesn't know how to stop you. The society itself can become necrophilus. And that just means a lover of death. Because this is the death. The blowing up of the tracks is death. Taking something that was alive and vital and really truly progressive and stopping it. That's the necrophile. You're a lover of death. So this is where we're at. This is a description of the map of where the hell we are.
It's a profound thing to think on a little while that people prefer death over authenticity, which is extraordinary, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Right.
Give me death rather than to be authentic, to be myself. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something
Uh,
about the movement that is deeply troubling. Not to a heroic person. That's what the word heroic means.
Bigger the challenge, the better, to the
Yeah.
heroic.
You
Yeah,
just
yeah.
take, you are the fool. You're on the hero's journey. You understand that there's rites of passage. You want the wind in your hair. You want the sound of the hooves on the cobblestones. You're okay. But the weak soul, and these are the feminized souls we're talking about, have been universally feminized. Even that movement that we're talking about is deeply painful. Yeah. And so they go to therapy, again, to get rid of the self. They go to therapy to say, I wish the whole world could change and be as morbid as I am.
Everything but me. Let the world change.
Let the world change. Yeah. I like the artwork that's like vomit on a canvas. It doesn't have any meaning. In other words, what you're trying to say is all those people who had meaning in their life, I want to degrade them, the poets, the artists, the musicians. I hate it all. And society goes, well done. You top of the class in Princeton, Harvard, Cornell. You're top of the class. But promote the fuck out of you. Yeah, white man down, Western world down. All of this stasis, has become a virtue. And the outsider, the one who doesn't buy into it, he is becoming the pariah. He is becoming the hated one.
Absolutely. And I think I'll read a little bit more at the end of your article here, Michael, just to maybe summarize what we went over so far, and then I'll pass it back to you and we'll wrap up from there. So yeah, let me just share again once more. Yeah, we started with Jung, we'll end with Jung here a bit. So back to your article. Man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously, in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state, and this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. What we call the psyche is by no means identical with our consciousness and its contents. Now that it has been established the feeling is the essence, if not the cause of consciousness, a lot of obscure matters are clarified. It is, for example, axiomatic that feelings cannot be shared. Certainly, one cannot know what it is like to be another person, and just as certainly we cannot feel like someone else. This is where science gets off. If feeling is the bottom line, as personalists hold, then they are hermetically sealed, so to speak. It is the individual who feels, who introspects, and interocepts. He does so within himself, and for all the colour of language, he cannot really express his feelings to others. Moreover, the other is caught up experiencing their own feelings, every minute of the day and night. What we share are words and language, not feelings. Schelling stressed the uniqueness of each human being. He described the age-old teleological movement from unconsciousness to self-consciousness. Only humans are lucidly self-conscious beings. Indeed, to invent science and ask scientific questions about consciousness and reality presupposes self-consciousness. Therefore, implies Schelling, it follows that self-consciousness is the greatest mystery of all that it isn't even considered by most people. This truly holy mystery isn't important to people as they go about thinking, feeling, and acting. But as said, this is where science gets off. Whatever answers there are to this mystery, the mystery of the self, they will not be discovered and broadcast collectively. There is no end to the mystery of the self. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Blake, Barfield, Buber, Jung, and others of their kind knew it. The self is not a butterfly to be caught, killed, and pinned to a board. Jung would say that whatever one intuits about the nature of the psyche is afforded by the psyche. As he rightly declared, the psyche is not in us, rather, we are in the psyche. And I'll pass it back over to you, Michael.
Yeah, well, see, that's a little bit of an idealistic statement. I don't think he was an idealist to that degree, but it's close. He was playing on the theme of idealism there, but it's panpsychism, pandeism, you could call it. The idea that the psyche is too great just for us to be able to house it as if, it's our property. And I like that. Yeah, he's looking at it from a broad perspective. His last book was Nature Has a Soul, and it's well worth reading. He became a sort of a panpsychicism. And believe you me, we already spoke about religious naturalism. Jung was a religious naturalist, in my opinion. He was a mystical naturalist. He would have been very comfortable with that school if he was alive today. I feel he would have endorsed it. He would have been very comfortable with this naturalistic pantheism, and they are all right with him. The ones today, this school, from what I know of them, I can easily see that they could adopt Jung, but that's right. It's just, we tend to be wanting to own the psyche, say it's an attribute of our own consciousness, and this may be wrong. This is not how the real mystic thinks. Because remember, what they're trying to say is, what is it that ordained this process, this teleological process from the state of complete blank unconsciousness up to self-consciousness? That's a miracle. And the materialists have their answer, but there's no need for us to just accept it wholesale. Right? It's too miraculous. It's too bizarre for a simple explanation. It really is. It's just too complex. Too many things involved in it. And although we take it for granted, the idea that we are self-conscious beings, it is very, very important. And also, because it's a movement from unconscious to conscious to unconscious, maybe there's another level to it that hasn't arrived yet. Maybe there is super consciousness waiting. See?
Colin Wilson always spoke about that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so did
Yeah.
Alan Watts. And then Teilhard de Chardin and others. They thought this may not be the last stage. And in their own demented way, the posthumanists believe it. They just think it has to do more with computers and organic computers and all of that nonsense. They're wrong. They're deeply wrong. But nevertheless, there could be more of a higher evolution coming. There's also that to bear in mind, because this thing does look like it has been a progress, a true organic process that it has to do with freedom. We'll have to leave that for another time. But it seems that there is some sort of school of thought to which many scientists belong that believe that there will be a time, in which there will be, higher awareness. And then a lot of these questions that we have will be answered. In fact, even Owen Barfield, in his own way, he spoke about a period called final participation, which will be, exactly, a return to the original participation, but in the future. Once we get it right, once we understand what's been going on. So some of these people were very hopeful. I think Plato was as well, at the end of the day. But there are certain aberrations, and we've got this hidden hand of control that wants to always subvert the human journey program. They do that on the individual level through the schooling, through indoctrination. And they also, as we know now, they work on the psyche to regress you. You see, they know that you are frustrated with being a self, and that there's a little thought in the back of your mind that if I wasn't a self, if I could dissolve that somehow, all my worries would be over. The mind does think like that. It has this oblivion complex, and the East has perfected that. They think suffering will, sabhe dukkam, everything is sorrow. And if you got rid of the organ of suffering, that's the self, you wouldn't suffer. And believe you me, that's taken hold. And, they're in the millions, these renunciates, these so-called sadhus. This really caught on. It was only a matter of time before we knew that it will move over to the West. And so the discontents in the West, who themselves have slowed down, their own development, they've formed a necrophilous relationship with telos. They might subscribe then to some of these necrophilous things, but not as necrophilous. You're going to have to embellish it to make it look all holy. Put a couple of halos, put a couple of mantras, get some believable Yeah, that's right. And get these guru types that are seductive in that way, and get a bunch of gormless women in the New Age movement to go over and kiss their feet. It'll work. And that's when the first one came over, Swami Vivekananda, and he did his very first conference, he said, "Sisters and brothers of
Oh,
America."
fuck's sake. Yeah.
He addressed the women first and foremost. Do you think that was an accident? Yet you know damn well that when you go to India, they're the most patriarchal people on the planet. Treat women like, fucking cattle. But when he came to America, Svengali, this chameleon, starts pretending he's addressing the sisters, and they will. These stupid spiritualists went for it. Have you ever been to India? You think he's legitimate? These spiritual paths treat you like a servant. The woman is a servant to all of these monks and priests. Same in Islam, the imam touches a woman with a stick. They have a little stick. Oh, no, I'm telling you. They touch the man with their hands to bless, and when a woman comes for the blessing, they take out a little special stick and touch the woman on the shoulder. It's no different in the Far East. But these gormless Western women fell for it, and they still are falling for it. Yeah. See? This is the price that you pay for ignorance. But the men are just as bad, flocking over there. It's okay to study a thing.
Yes, of course.
And the earlier pre-Vedic roots of these things is quite pure. It's very amazing, actually, when you get into it, because it's all Aryan. It's an ancient Aryan teachings that were so pure, but they got disfigured over time. They got tarnished, and some very clever sorcerers got hold of it and repackaged it. But I specialize in the works that, restore it back to its original. And believe you me, that's an incredible story. We've done a few programs on that, but it's a mighty, mighty subject. Maybe one day we'll get to talk about it more.
Yeah, we'll have to go into that at some time. And we haven't even really got into the differences of the psychology between men and women and the differences of those as well too. But that's going to be its whole own dedicated podcast, I think, because it's obviously so important to the architects of control. And we came up with George Orwell earlier. One of his lines, I can't remember if it was in 1984, he said, "In the most bigoted adherents of Big Brother, of that sort of world, is the young women," sadly with it. Is there any final thoughts for us, Michael? I think sort of the major themes of today was about, we understood a little bit more about the persona as another structure of the psyche. We spoke a bit about how people can get lost in concepts of the self, whereas the self is maybe more about feeling, and is how one comes to know that. And we spoke about how the architects of control try to pervert this feeling and to try to get you to maybe identify more with the crowd and to go after those kind of highs instead of the kind of feelings that the outsider feels and comes to understand more. Is there anything you think we haven't touched on that we should as well also, or should we wrap that up for today?
Certainly when it comes to
Or
that
go
point,
ahead.
at the difference between feeling and thinking and the left and the right brain,
Yes.
one would then want to start to enhance their sense of feeling. And this then comes with shadow work or body work, in which
Arthur Yanov.
your body regulation, you'd have to break down your armoring, and start to work. The key to this is the body work, along the lines of what Wilhelm Reich was talking about, getting rid of your emotional plague and all of those things that stand in the way of that sensitization. It's very difficult to do when you're living in the urban environment, because the urban environment is itself armored.
It is a collective. Yeah.
Yeah, everything about it, you see, flies in the face of what we're talking about. And that's why you take refuge in the head. You take refuge in the thinking until you come across these metaphysical realities where thinking isn't going to help you. You just go round and round. Yeah. And the deeper feeling that is now known to be the base of all thinking, this is proven by the neuroscientists. I mean, it's not woo-woo. This is now the new paradigm. We are not in touch with it. Most people, they've lost this inner sensitivity. And you're not going to be able to get in touch with it unless this armoring breaks down to a certain degree. And I really don't think that that's even possible if you're spending most of your time in nature. Sorry, in the world, right? In the urban environment. But then the thing is, when people go to nature, they're not going to nature. They're going to do sports. or rock climbing or bungee jumping or sailing or something like that. They're only in nature for a theme park. Yeah. Wearing their headphones, jogging. This is not being in nature. They're walking their dog. That's not being in nature. So it's nonsense, right? Being in nature is actually an art now. So one has to bring in the Umwelt, which the outsider does, because he's twigged all of this from the day one. He might have had to be forced to be a participant in the world, but he always was against it. For other needs, family needs, material needs, he may have had to, he didn't have the choice. And also it's okay, because then you learn from the inside what it's like. But you can still be an outsider, you see. So his return to nature will be much more authentic. He won't be using it as just some theme park. And then he'll know that now the new science is validating, right, that there's a calibration. And then if you read your McGilchrist, you can say, oh my God, this is the legacy of the left brain. The moving into cognition, the moving into thought, a special kind of thought, is distance me from the right brain, is then the advent of the left brain, and then you can get into that to find out what that's all about. And he wrote a great book on it, The Master and His Emissary, to walk you through that whole paradigm. And he's got some very interesting, things to say. He talks a lot about Heidegger in the book. He talks about Merleau-Ponty. Yeah, very, very great work. And there's lots of videos that he talks about this. We need to be up to speed on this, because the left brain and the right brain are two different views, you see, of the reality.
Yeah, he even sees them as two different personalities. I
That
know
can
people
happen.
maybe not even familiar with his work. Again, he'd be a psychiatrist. Some of the original experiments they used to do for patients who had epilepsy, and what happens with epilepsy is a certain neuron, I guess, would fire off and it would travel across the brain, and then they would have these severe seizures. So what they used to do was, because your brain is split, they would sort of sever or section the little bit of connective tissue between them. Again, it didn't damage people in a severe way, but what they quickly found out was that people started to have two different personalities going on and will come up with different answers to different questions. People should really look into that kind of work to get a much better understanding of the difference between the left and the right hemisphere as well, also, as you're describing.
And the good thing is he brings up the more unorthodox, anti-materialistic aspect, because there's books been written on that subject, but they're normally by the materialists. So they play down some of the more anti-materialistic parts, whereas McGilchrist is much more unbiased and balanced. And he looks at some of the more interesting aspects that other writers would sort of play down. So yeah, it's very, very good. People should get the book or the audio book, or at least listen to some of his videos. He's one of the most important. And also he's important because he's extremely eminent academically. Extremely eminent. So
Top
I
of the
try
food
to
chain, yeah.
specialize in those people. Yeah. Very high level.
Mm-hmm. There's a great episode of where he's been interviewed, I think it's by Jordan Peterson, and you can sort of see the differences between them. There's a great little moment where he asks Jordan, where they're having a productive conversation. He goes, oh, are you into the occult? Have you read about it as well? And he sort of lit up, and Jordan goes, no, and just moves on past it. And I sort of thought, oh, this is the thing he's missing,
Yeah,
this is the thing that Jung was obsessed with, was the occult. The occult was massive, and he speak about, the Kabbalah and all these types of things. And I could tell that Tsarion McGilchrist was very into that. He only recently got to, I remember in the interview he had said that, so he only came into it in the second half of his life, reading about the Kabbalah and that type of thing. But that's the thing I think Jordan Peterson was always missing. He never tapped into the occult, really. Yeah.
Right.
He's afraid of it, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's always good to keep up to speed with these latest thinkers. And people can go to my Shelling Zone site, where I mention the historical and some of the more up-to-date guys that people got to know about. And then I have my little mysticism article.
You have multiple books on the subject as well.
Yeah,
Disciples of the Mysterium.
But if people just want a quicker, menu, read the mysticism article. It's a short article on michaeltsarion.com. We can link up to it. And then visit the shellingzone.com site for more of these mystics, this tradition. Because once you start seeing the flaws and the dangers, actually, of these Eastern paths, you will become very jaded, unless you realize that no, there was a authentic Western Hermetic tradition which is absolutely deep, rich, and fascinating, and it's been shunted to the side. And it serves you well. Like I said, getting into Whitehead, and then
Yeah.
before him, others that one could mention.
German idealists.
Yeah. Um, I could certainly recommend my Idealism series on Unslaved. It's 5 parts. But there's other
Yeah.
ones like The Moral Universe, Age of
Mm.
Dionysus,
Mm-hmm.
Mysticism, 2 programs. There's no
Mm-hmm.
shortage of programs. Mystical Naturalism, there's another program.
Yeah.
And that's just a short list. There must be over 100 programs by now
Yeah.
harping on these points, both in existentialism and
Yeah.
on idealism as well. And it's not
Yeah.
about wearing a T-shirt. It's just about sort of resurrecting a rich
Mm.
archive of knowledge,
Mm.
that will help you deconstruct the deconstructionists. See, the critical theorists are brilliant at their critical theory, except in one regard. They don't criticize themselves. The deconstructionists are great, except in one area, themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? You have to turn it around.
Yeah.
The critical theorist never reflects on his own lunacy. And it's the same with these deconstructionists. Everything is worthy of deconstruction except their own bankrupt philosophies.
Yeah. Isn't that it? Yeah. Super. I think that's enough again today for people to work with for a little bit. That'll keep them tan over for another week or two with it, certainly. Thank you very much again, Michael, for coming on and for sharing all this wisdom. I know it's taken you so long to go through all of these things and you articulate so brilliantly. So just thank you very much again. And we'll certainly leave links down below to all of your work once more and people can check these out and hopefully tune in again for next time. But
Definitely.
any final word, Michaels, or we'll wrap it up?
No, thanks a lot, mate.
Yeah.
It's great to talk
Super.
to you always and get into these subjects. Can't do it with a host that doesn't know shit. So really inspired
Fair
with
enough.
this and really
That's great.
looking forward to the talks we do. So big
Yeah.
kudos
And
to
I
you,
think
mate.
as these, we're still only skimming the surface. Like that's what I can't emphasize enough. Once you really build upon these different structures, and you can get a whole different framework with it, like it'll completely change your life. And so hopefully
Yeah,
we can give that kind of value to people with it. So
right.
yeah, thank you very much again.
You're welcome, mate.
And yeah, we'll see everybody next time. All the best now. Thank you.